"You can't fish here, sir. This is HOA property." That was the moment it all began. The exact second my quiet Saturday morning turned into a suburban battlefield. The water was calm, the sun barely up, the kind of peaceful dawn where you can almost hear your thoughts. Then came her voice, sharp, commanding, and echoing off the lake like a siren. Clipboard in hand, Marla Henderson marched down the gravel path, her designer flats crunching like judgment itself. Her mirrored sunglasses flashed in the light, hiding her eyes, but not her disdain. And behind her, two of her HOA loyalists followed, nodding like backup dancers in a petty power play. You will not believe how fast a simple fishing line can reel in an entire neighborhood's war. 3 weeks earlier, I'd closed on the house, my first real slice of freedom after years of apartment living. The listing called it Lakeside Serenity. A modest 2-story with peeling paint and a crooked mailbox, but the dock, that dock sealed the deal. I could fish at dawn, kayak at sunset, and finally breathe air that didn't smell like traffic. But I should have known serenity has a price tag when you're living under an HOA. The Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association ran this place like a small-town government. They had a 46-page covenant, color-coded, indexed, and dripping with phrases like community standards and uniform property maintenance. I'd skimmed it, of course. Who really reads all that? Turns out, Marla did, probably daily. She'd been HOA president for 6 years straight, elected unopposed each time, and people said she took her job seriously. I didn't understand what that meant until the morning she fined me for fishing on my own dock. When she appeared that day, I thought maybe she was joking. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I live here. This is my dock." She raised one manicured eyebrow like a prosecutor. "Your dock, perhaps, but the lake, Mr. Dalton, that's HOA property. And according to Covenant Article 4, Section 2B, fishing requires an association-approved permit." She said association-approved, like it was a holy relic. I blinked, thinking she'd lost her mind. "It's a lake," I said. "There are fish. I have a rod. That's kind of how this works." Her lips tightened. "Rules are rules," she replied, and pulled out a pink citation slip, pre-filled like she'd planned this moment. The fine was $75, payable within 10 business days. She tore off my copy with theatrical precision and handed it to me like she was serving a warrant. Now, if you've never dealt with a power-drunk HOA president, you might think, just pay the fine and move on. But that's not how it works in places like Willow Creek. Because once they smell compliance, they circle back for more. I'd seen the whispers on the neighborhood Facebook group about Marla fining a retiree for having unapproved solar lights, another family for hanging laundry visible from the street. One guy even got written up for having an American flag on a pole 2 inches taller than the HOA maximum. It was less a community and more a kingdom, with Marla as queen, crown made of bylaws. That morning, as I folded the citation into my pocket, she smirked like she'd just taught another peasant a lesson. But something in me hardened. Maybe it was the way she glanced at my dock, my favorite part of the property, like it was hers. Maybe it was the smug tone in her voice when she said, "If you have questions, the HOA office is open Tuesdays from 9 to 11 a.m. Who's free on a Tuesday morning? It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about principle. 2 days later, I went to that HOA office, a converted garage beside the community clubhouse. Inside, it smelled like lemon disinfectant and frustration. Marla sat at the head of a folding table, flanked by her board. Gary, the retired engineer who calculated everything in decimals, and Susan, the self-proclaimed aesthetic coordinator who once fined her own cousin for using mismatched mulch. "Mr. Dalton," Marla greeted, her tone dripping with civility, "to what do we owe the pleasure?" "I'm here to appeal this fishing citation," I said, laying the pink slip on the table. Gary adjusted his glasses. "You were fishing without an HOA permit." "I didn't know I needed one. The lake's behind my property." Marla leaned forward, steepling her fingers. "The lake is a shared community feature. All members must obtain authorization to ensure compliance with environmental standards." I almost laughed. "Environmental standards? You mean the algae-covered pond out back?" Susan gasped softly, as if I'd cursed in church. Marla's smile tightened again. "Mr. Dalton, sarcasm won't help your case. The rules exist for everyone's benefit." You ever have that moment where you realize you're in a losing game, but you play anyway just to see how far it goes? That was me right then. I asked for a copy of the bylaws. She hesitated, then slid me one. 46 pages, double-sided, highlighted in places. "You're welcome to review them. We pride ourselves on transparency." I spent the next night going through that binder like a detective combing evidence. Articles, sections, subsections. Most of it was standard stuff: lawn height, trash can visibility, exterior paint colors. But when I reached Article 4, Section 2B, the fishing clause, something caught my eye. It referenced a permit system established in 1999, but there was no mention who actually issued the permits. The original developer had dissolved the management company years ago, meaning Marla had resurrected an unenforceable rule and started charging people for it. That's when I knew I wasn't just dealing with a busybody. I was dealing with someone who had built her own little regime, and no one had challenged her in years.
The next morning, I drafted a letter citing the outdated clause and submitted it by certified mail, as required under HOA appeal procedure. By law, the board had 15 days to respond. On the 14th day, I got an envelope taped to my door. Inside was my appeal. Denied. Handwritten note at the bottom: "Compliance ensures harmony. Please respect community guidelines." Signed, Marla Henderson. I'll admit I saw red, not because of the $75, but because she'd used the word harmony like she owned it. That evening, while watering my lawn, my neighbor Tom walked over. "You too, huh?" he said, nodding toward the paper in my hand. Turns out I wasn't the only one. Tom had been fined for leaving his kayak on the shore overnight. Another neighbor, Jenna, had been warned about her non-standard mailbox design. The fines weren't random, they were control mechanisms, and Marla was the puppeteer. You ever wonder how far someone like that will go to stay in power? You're about to find out. The next Saturday, I fished again. Same dock, same coffee, but this time I brought witnesses. Tom and Jenna sat nearby, sipping their mugs, pretending to chat while their phone cameras quietly recorded. When Marla appeared, right on cue, clipboard in hand, she looked momentarily surprised to see she had an audience. "Still violating HOA regulations, I see," she said, her tone sharp as ever. "Actually, I'm exercising my right to use my property adjacent to the common area under Section 3, subsection D." Her jaw twitched. "That's not applicable. You're still in violation." Tom grinned. "Isn't it interesting, though, how the HOA can fine for something not even under their jurisdiction?" Marla's confidence faltered. Just a flicker, but enough to see she didn't expect pushback. "You're all making a mistake," she warned. "You don't know what you're getting into." And maybe she was right, because when you start pulling on a thread like that, one that's been tied around a whole neighborhood for years, you have no idea what's about to unravel. That night, I received another letter. Not a fine this time, a notice of hearing. The HOA board had scheduled a disciplinary review for patterns of non-compliance and community disruption. They were trying to make an example out of me. I remember standing at my window that evening, watching the lake ripple under the port's lights. My dock creaked softly in the breeze. Somewhere across the water, Marla's house glowed like a lighthouse of authority. And I realized something chilling. This wasn't just about fishing. It was about ownership, of property, of peace, of freedom. I didn't know it then, but that pink slip she handed me was the first move in a much bigger game, one that would end with her downfall and the lake itself changing hands. But I'll tell you this, before I ever bought that lake, before the lawsuits and the whispers and the meetings that turned into shouting matches, there was this night, the one where I decided I'd had enough. And that decision, it changed everything.
Removal notice. HOA non-compliant watercraft. Remove within 48 hours or subject to impound. Her sticker looked like a summons from a tiny, petty court. The orange caught the morning light and made the canoe look criminal, like evidence behind glass. I had coffee on my breath and salt on my shoes, and suddenly everything felt staged. Marla stood at the path with her clipboard, sunglasses like a judge's blindfold, except she always knew what she wanted to see. Phones popped up from neighboring porches. Someone always wanted to live stream a scandal. You will not believe how fast a morning can turn. 3 weeks earlier, I'd closed on the place I thought would be a refuge. 2 stories, a sagging cedar porch, and direct frontage to the lake that had sold me the house. I'd named the canoe before I'd even netted a fish, Bluebird. The covenants binder sat in a drawer, thumb-worn from the previous owner. Like most, I skimmed it for paint colors and trash days, and then shoved it aside. That was my first mistake. The HOA operated by a 58-page covenant packet and a culture of informal enforcement few newcomers ever saw in full. That morning, I walked to the clubhouse at 9 a.m., the building smelling faintly of powdered coffee and stale muffins. Marla greeted me with the smile of someone who believes rules exist to prove her point. "Mr. Dalton," she said, as if the paper in my hand were a report card, "we received multiple complaints about your canoe being visible from the shore." "Who complained?" I asked. She glanced at Gary and replied, "We don't disclose complainants." The standard answer protected people and, conveniently, shielded the engine of enforcement. I filed my appeal that afternoon by certified mail. The covenant specified a hearing procedure for disputes, certified notice, a hearing within 30 days, and the chance to present evidence and witnesses. I was meticulous. I photographed Bluebird's placement with a tape measure showing the 3-foot buffer from my lot line, pulled a county parcel map delineating private lots from the common shoreline, and printed municipal guidance about littoral adjacency, indicating that homeowners adjacent to common areas often have maintenance rights absent explicit prohibition. At the hearing, 2 weeks later, the clubhouse felt like civic theater. Marla sat at the head of the table in her signature blazer. Gary kept a logbook of prior violations. Susan, the aesthetic enforcer, knitted her brow. "We've had multiple reports that personal items are being stored adjacent to common areas," Marla announced, reading anonymous notes with solemnity. I laid out maps, photos, and receipts. "This is my private property," I said. "If the board intends to assert jurisdiction over adjacent private lots, it must adopt a formal authorization procedure and publish it for members." Gary muttered, "Precedent," as if precedent were a statute. The board stuck to a script. Complainants are protected, and enforcement preserves harmony. Small confrontations accumulated like sediment. 3 days later, a neighbor texted, "Someone was here last night cutting the lock." The cable lock on Bluebird had been neatly sliced. The cable lay on the grass like a severed tether. I filed a police report. The deputy took a statement and advised documentation. The HOA's reply suggested cooperation to maintain neighborhood standards. a neutral phrasing that avoided assigning blame or acknowledging possible intimidation. I began to map patterns. Marla's enforcement followed a rhythm: an anonymous complaint, an inspection, and a sticker at dawn. Notices were printed on the same bright stock and distributed theatrically, handed out in the early morning as if to dramatize the offense to the neighborhood. When I traced other actions through the online community forum and old meeting minutes, stories emerged. A family fined for a flagpole 2 inches too tall. A widow pressured to remove wind chimes. A young couple charged a cleanup fee after an anonymous report about their grill. One afternoon, I cornered Marla near the mail kiosk. "Why are you picking on people's kayaks and canoes?" I asked, quieter than the mailbox chatter. She smiled with practiced warmth. "We preserve community standards," she said. "It's about uniformity." "Is uniformity worth policing with anonymous complaints?" I countered. For a beat she hesitated, then said, "We answer to the community," which felt only true if the community knew the whole truth. At night, I assembled a paper trail: old newsletters, meeting minutes, and a scanned amendment from 2004 referencing authorization for waterfront use without defining a process. In a margin of a 2012 minute, a handwritten note bore Marla's name next to "informal permit system created to preserve shoreline aesthetics." Informal. That word leapt off the page. If rules were informal, enforcement could be selective. Tensions climbed at a weekend barbecue when Marla mentioned the canoe to a cluster of retirees. "We're protecting the view," she said brightly. Faces tilted toward her, social gravity did the rest. If authority shaped opinion, opinion justified action. Enforcement became performance, and performances built legitimacy. Then an escalation. A new sticker on Bluebird, labeled "Violation Number 32", with a scrawled line beneath, "Subject to impound." The implication felt radioactive. I installed a motion camera under the eave that night because evidence is the only antidote to rumor. At 2:03 a.m., the footage showed a hooded figure moving along the shore, flashlight bobbing, rifling through items and cutting the cable lock. I took the footage to the sheriff's office. "HOA disputes are civil, but vandalism is criminal. We'll investigate." The investigation lagged. Paperwork, thin leads, neighbors reluctant to speak. And in the meantime, the HOA issued a second, sterner notice citing repeated noncompliance and tacking on a line about removal and associated costs billed to the homeowner. I started talking to neighbors off the record. Edith, the widow on Elm, removed her garden gnomes after a friendly reminder. A young couple quietly reimbursed a so-called cleanup fee. A teacher confessed she stopped watering her lawn to avoid a warning about excessive water usage. The pattern knit together. A president leveraging ambiguity and social pressure to enforce compliance selectively. One morning, I received a thick, certified envelope, a formal demand to remove Bluebird within 48 hours or face assessment. The lake that had promised quiet now felt like contested ground. The deputy's caution stayed with me. Civil remedies would take time, and time favored the status quo. I shifted tactics quietly. I filed a records request for enforcement logs and minutes, pulled county parcel maps to confirm exact boundary lines, and consulted 2 local attorneys about littoral adjacency and HOA authority. I printed emails and anonymous notes, logged dates, and made a timeline. 2 weeks later, the board scheduled a community standards hearing. The clubhouse crowd felt brittle. Some regulars watched, some stayed away, and Marla took the podium with practiced ease. When she opened with language about pride and preservation, I stood and asked for the documentation that authorized any shoreline permit process. The room hushed. Gary shuffled papers. Susan blinked. Marla answered that the system has worked for years, which is not the same as lawful. A murmur passed through the crowd. Some neighbors shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the sound of transparency. After the meeting, the board posted another stern notice, citing repeated noncompliance and possible assessments. That night, I received the certified demand again, thicker with intent. Bluebird bobbed by the dock, and the lake inhaled cool air. What began as a petty aesthetic complaint had swollen into a structural question about who gets to define shared space and how transparent those definitions must be. I knew then this wasn't just about a canoe. It was about the way vague rules can calcify into authority when no one asks for the paperwork. If I backed down, the doctrine of selective enforcement would harden. If I thought, I risked becoming a spectacle. The neighborhood had started to shift in private ways, a text here, a quiet nod there, but the real test would be whether people would step into daylight to demand clarity. I held the demand letter and watched Bluebird drift, thinking, compliance preserves quiet. Resistance might open a window that lets sunlight into 60 pages of shadowed enforcement. What would happen if we did not merely answer her stickers, but asked for the books that authorized them?
You fined my kid for lemonade? The room went dead quiet. You could almost hear the fluorescent lights buzzing above the HOA conference table. Marla froze mid-sentence, her usual smile faltering just long enough for everyone to notice. It was the first real crack in her armor. Gary, the vice president, shuffled his papers like that sound could drown out the tension. But it couldn't. The moment hung heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm that refuses to pass. You could feel it. That was the night the neighborhood stopped pretending. That was the night the uprising began. The meeting had started like every other. Cold coffee, stale cookies, and a circle of folding chairs that made it feel more like detention than democracy. Marla stood at the front, her posture sharp, a stack of violation notices beside her like ammunition. "We're here to maintain order and community values," she'd said, tapping her clipboard as if it were scripture. But the crowd wasn't nodding this time. A dozen homeowners stared her down, eyes filled with a quiet kind of fury. You could sense something shifting, a neighborhood that had spent years swallowing her rules suddenly finding its voice. 3 weeks earlier, it had just been me, the guy with the non-compliant canoe. I thought I was alone. But then came the fines for improper holiday decor, the ban on unapproved mulch, and the now infamous lemonade stand violation. A 7-year-old fined $50 for running a lemonade stand on her driveway. That's what cracked the dam. You can bully adults with bylaws, but touch their kids, and you've declared war. I remember that evening vividly. The sun was dropping behind the cul-de-sac, sprinklers ticking rhythmically, when Sharon from Lot 12 knocked on my door. She looked both furious and defeated. "They fined us," she said, holding up a yellow slip. $50 for lemonade. Her daughter clutched a plastic cup, half full, staring up at her mom like she couldn't understand what they did wrong. I took the paper, read the violation code, Section 8, Subsection D, unauthorized commercial activity. A rule intended to stop people from running actual businesses out of their garages, twisted to target a child. Marla's doing. Always Marla. That's when I started keeping notes, times, dates, signatures. I created a spreadsheet, cross-referencing every fine, every violation notice, every neighbor's name. Patterns emerged. Fines were heavier on new homeowners, lighter on her inner circle. She called it consistency. I called it control. A few nights later, I met with Sharon and 3 other neighbors on my back porch. We whispered like teenagers planning a prank, except this was bigger. This was about taking back our neighborhood. We couldn't post publicly. Marla monitored the community forum like a hawk. So we created a private group chat under the innocent name Garden Club Weekly. Only 5 of us at first. Within days, it was 12, then 20. Everyone had a story. One guy had been fined for parking his truck in view of the street for 10 minutes while unloading groceries. Another woman received a warning about unsightly patio furniture after buying chairs from a store Marla didn't like. You see the pattern, right? Every rule was arbitrary, a net cast just wide enough to catch anyone she wanted. And if you fought back, suddenly your trash cans were out too early, or your lawn was inconsistent in color. That's how she kept control, through exhaustion. We decided to fight smart, not loud. The next week, I started requesting official records. Under our state's HOA transparency laws, any member has the right to inspect budgets, correspondence, and enforcement logs with written notice. Marla delayed, of course. She claimed the records were under audit. That was her favorite stalling tactic. But by law, she had 10 business days to comply. I marked every deadline, every stall, every excuse. You'll see why that mattered later. By the second week, rebellion was blooming quietly behind every manicured hedge. The retirees on Willow Lane, her most loyal supporters, had started whispering doubts. One of them, Mr. Porter, cornered me at the mailbox. "You think she's overstepping?" he asked, low. "We just want peace." I told him peace doesn't mean silence, it means fairness. He didn't answer, but a few nights later, he joined the garden club chat under the name Daisy Watcher. One night, while sorting through old newsletters for evidence, I found something. A half-forgotten clause buried in the HOA's Articles of Incorporation. Section 12.4. Common area governance shall not extend beyond designated easement boundaries. In plain English, the HOA only had jurisdiction over the shared grounds, not the lake, not the docks, and certainly not my canoe. That clause was like a grenade with the pin still intact. I read it 3 times, heart pounding. If the lake wasn't under HOA control, every fine she'd issued about it was void. I didn't tell anyone yet, not until I was sure. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Normally, 10 people showed up. That night, nearly 50 packed into the small clubhouse. The air smelled of coffee, sweat, and frustration. Marla began, as always, "Welcome, neighbors," but the tone had changed. Murmurs rippled through the room, like static before a broadcast. Sharon stood first, waving her violation slip. "You fined my kid for lemonade?" Gasps, then nods, then applause. Marla tried to regain control. "Let's maintain civility," she said, smiling tight. But the crowd wasn't backing down. A man in the back shouted, "What about my grill fine?" Another woman, "You threatened to tow my car for being in my driveway." The noise swelled. You could see her confidence falter. She tapped her clipboard, demanded order, cited the bylaws like holy scripture, but every citation only reminded us how absurd they'd become. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. When the noise subsided, I stood. "Marla," I said, keeping my voice calm, "under Section 12.4 of the Articles of Incorporation, the HOA has no authority over the lake or its shoreline. Isn't that correct?" She tightened her jaw. She didn't answer. "Because," I continued, "you've issued multiple fines regarding property beyond your jurisdiction, which means—" "That's enough," she snapped, louder than she meant. The room went silent. You could feel the shift, the authority slipping. People were no longer afraid. They were curious. She tried to adjourn the meeting early, claiming hostile atmosphere, but several neighbors refused to leave. Phones recorded everything. The spell she'd held over us for years was breaking in real time. By the time she stormed out, face flushed, the clubhouse was buzzing like a liberated hive. After that night, everything changed. Neighbors waved again. People talked openly on porches instead of whispering. We started holding our own informal community circles. No fines, no rules, just conversation. And every week, another confidential document slipped into my mailbox from someone inside the HOA board. Anonymous envelopes, handwritten notes, photos of Marla's private correspondence. The power shift was subtle but seismic. Still, I knew better than to celebrate too soon. She wasn't beaten, not yet. A cornered Karen doesn't retreat, she regroups. And if I knew Marla, she'd be digging through every bylaw, every loophole, every procedural trick to claw back control. The difference now? She wasn't the only one playing that game. Because what she didn't know, not yet, was that I'd already found the clause that could unravel her entire empire. The lake, the jurisdiction, the one line she'd never read closely enough. I'd seen her kind of power before, the kind that hides behind rules until someone turns the light on. And soon, I was going to do just that. The question was simple and terrifying. Once you start a revolution in a place built on silence, how far are you willing to go to finish it?
Technically, the lawyer said, sliding the paper across the table, the HOA doesn't own the lake. It's leased. I remember the silence that followed that sentence like a held breath. It landed on me with the weight of a verdict and the lightness of possibility at the same time. That morning, I'd walked into the attorney's office with a stack of certified envelopes and a binder of covenants. I left with a single line of title history and a plan that felt ridiculous and precise all at once. You will not believe how a clause hidden in the chain of title could rewrite control of a neighborhood. But that's exactly what happened to us. 3 weeks earlier, Marla had handed me another violation, claiming my dock furniture altered the shoreline's appearance. Petty, theatrical, timed to be visible to anyone driving by. I thought about fighting every notice, but litigation favors attrition. HOAs win by the slow burn and by exhausting dissent. So I did what felt steadier than slogging through court filings. I read everything. I pulled plats from the county recorder, scanned the chain of title, and discovered the lake parcel had a complicated history. It had been created as part of the original development, retained in fee by a holding company, and then, critically, had not been properly transferred when the developer dissolved. That little administrative gap is where authority gets blurry and power can be challenged. I met with a real estate attorney who explained the route forward in unadorned language. Confirm the record owner, check for liens, monitor tax status, and be prepared for a treasurer's sale or a negotiated purchase. Quiet title might be necessary if anyone contested our claim, and title insurance would be essential. The attorney's checklist read like a bridge. If I crossed it, I could stand on record title. If I hesitated, the bridge might collapse under other people's objections. You always underestimate how boring and bureaucratic the fight to change a system feels. Then you underestimate how consequential the paperwork is. Over the next month, while Marla continued her rounds, distributing bright violation slips in the dawn like tiny proclamations, I prepared. I formed an LLC, Bluebird Shore Investments, because large moves need legal discretion. I quietly pooled funds with 2 neighbors who had been fined for trivial things and wanted the pattern stopped, but did not want their names on the record. We watched the county notices together. When the owner of the lake parcel failed to pay taxes, we were ready at the treasurer's sale. The auction room smelled of printer toner and economy, of people who understood numbers as opportunity. When the lake parcel was called, my hand stayed steady and my bid won at a modest premium over the back taxes. Nothing theatrical, just the sound of the hammer on the clerk's desk and the clerk reading the parcel number into the record. The deed recorded 2 weeks later, a clerk's stamp and a new chain of title. The HOA reacted with predictable outrage. Marla sent mass emails accusing me of a hostile appropriation, convened emergency meetings, and circulated petitions promising litigation. She painted the purchase as an act of greed and urged homeowners to sign a retroactive authorization granting the HOA regulatory power over the shoreline. She tried to make her enforcement feel communal, even though it had always been personal. That was where paperwork helped. Ownership is paperwork, and paperwork converts vague assertions into formal obligations and defenses. Fee title did not instantly allow me to ban neighbors from the water, but it gave legal standing and a mandate to insist on transparency. I commissioned a surveyor to restake the lines at dawn and record an updated plat. The orange flag snapped in the breeze until the county had the new plan in its files. I ordered a short environmental memorandum to outline maintenance obligations, erosion control, riparian buffers, and dock permits, and an appraisal to determine reasonable funding. The reports let me propose a modest maintenance fund tied to a season pass. Framed properly, it would be about stewardship and liability, not exclusion. Marla met each administrative move with social spectacle. She staged a glossy meeting accusing me of privatizing a community asset, distributed flyers, and urged homeowners to sign petitions demanding rescission. In the clubhouse, she staged a confrontation and stood physically between my surveyor and the shoreline, telling him any work done without HOA sanction would be null. He produced his permit and the recorded deed. The bravado dissolved into mutters. At the same time, anonymous objections appeared in the quiet title docket, claims of prescriptive use, mysterious trusts asserting riparian rights, a faded corporate filing suggesting the developer might have some lingering claim. My attorney and I answered each with affidavits, recorded surveys, and sworn statements from residents who testified that the HOA had never held deeded title to the water. The judge entered judgment in favor of the recorded deed. The clerk's stamp was a small hammer that cleared decades of fog. The HOA reacted with predictable fury. Emails, op-eds in a neighborhood newsletter, a drive to raise counter-litigation funds. But the recorded documents had altered the legal arithmetic. Ownership brought responsibility. I could have locked gates and posted private property, but I had learned the cruel lesson of escalation. Instead, I drafted an access proposal. Reasonable hours, a modest season pass to fund shoreline upkeep, liability waivers, and a recorded memorandum clarifying historic use. I offered mediation, which framed me as reasonable and pushed Marla to choose, accept transparency or escalate to a divisive, costly fight. The mediation exposed fractures. Some longtime supporters admitted privately they preferred predictable rules to arbitrary fines. The deed bought leverage and forced disclosure. People began requesting minutes and enforcement logs, and the informal permits scrawled in a notebook came to light. Still, the deed did not end the story. Title can be clear and surveys precise, but communities are built on habit and fear as much as on lines on a map. Legal clarity changes the math, but human variables, loyalty, reputation, pride remain. I had bought time and leverage, but the neighborhood now had to choose whether to accept a transparent policy or let Marla push them into litigation that could scar our streets. What would she do next, when rules no longer ruled?
Her face turned crimson when she read the new sign, Private Property, No HOA Access. The irony tasted better than any victory I'd imagined. I watched from the dock, coffee in hand, the same place where months earlier she'd stormed up to me waving a clipboard and a violation notice like a royal decree. Now the clipboard was gone, replaced by disbelief and a trembling lip that couldn't quite form words. The murmurs around her grew into a low, uneasy hum, neighbors whispering, phones raised, snapshots taken. Some pretended to be shocked, others turned away, half smiling. You could feel it. The balance had shifted. The Queen had lost her water. But that morning wasn't spontaneous. It was carefully, legally, and painfully orchestrated. 3 days earlier, after the quiet title judgment went final, I'd filed the notice of ownership with the county clerk. No press releases, no online bragging, just paper. Power in this world is measured in what's recorded, not what's shouted. I'd already coordinated with a signage company under the LLC name, ensuring compliance with municipal visibility and size regulations. The signs arrived wrapped in plastic, smelling of vinyl and fresh ink. I remember unrolling the first one on my living room floor, the bold red lettering catching the morning light, Private Property, No HOA Access. It felt final, like the full stop at the end of a long, brutal sentence. By dawn that Friday, I posted 3 of them, one at the boat launch, one near the trail entrance, and one right by the gazebo where Marla loved to hold her community watch meetings. I half expected her to tear them down within the hour. Instead, she froze. When she arrived mid-morning, surrounded by her inner circle, retirees in pastel polos and sun visors, she looked like someone stepping into a dream that refused to end. "What is this?" she demanded, voice sharp enough to slice through the murmur. "Exactly what it says," I replied. "Private property. Access restricted." "You can't do this. The HOA maintains this lake." I sipped my coffee and looked out over the water, perfectly calm, the reflection of the sign rippling in the breeze. "Not anymore, Marla. Check the deed." The silence that followed was cinematic. A few neighbors gasped. Someone's phone chimed, breaking the tension like a gunshot. You could almost hear the machinery of HOA bureaucracy grinding to life, trying to make sense of what had just happened. By noon, she had called an emergency meeting. Yes, that's what the email said, twice. Effective immediately, all homeowners must attend an emergency HOA session regarding illegal seizure of community property. The email was a masterpiece of panic. Bold fonts, exclamation points, legal buzzwords tossed like confetti, injunction, trespass, restoration of access. That evening, the clubhouse was packed. Folding chairs creaked, fans buzzed, and tempers boiled. Marla stood at the front like a general rallying her troops. "We cannot let this stand," she barked. "This lake is ours. It belongs to the HOA, by right, by maintenance, by assumption," I interrupted. My voice cut through the noise. "Show the deed, Marla. Go ahead, pull it up." Her lips tightened. The HOA's lawyer, a weary man in a wrinkled suit, adjusted his glasses. "The association has historically maintained the lake, but title records do indicate ownership was never formally transferred to the HOA after developer dissolution." Gasps. Real, audible gasps. One woman clutched her husband's arm. Another muttered, "She's lying. She has to be." Marla slammed her hand on the podium. "We'll fight this. We'll get a court order." I smiled. "You'd need standing for that. And according to your own bylaws, Article 7, Section 3, you can't spend HOA funds on litigation over property not legally owned by the association." That one landed hard. The lawyer didn't move. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He knew I was right. HOA law is clear. Unless the property is deeded or formally conveyed to the association, it has no ownership interest. Maintenance alone doesn't equal control. And Marla, for all her authority, had never taken the time to check the fundamentals. The room turned on her, slowly at first, then with visible frustration. "So we've been paying for a lake we don't even own?" one homeowner shouted. "You fined me for putting a kayak rack on my property because it violated Lake View policy." Marla's face twitched. "I was enforcing standards." "Standards you made up," another voice yelled. For a moment, chaos filled the air. Neighbors shouting, chairs scraping, the lawyer raising his hands helplessly. It felt less like a meeting than like a mutiny. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth was enough. By the following morning, the signs became the talk of the entire subdivision. People drove past the lake just to see them, their glossy red letters glowing in the sunrise. Some celebrated the end of Marla's reign quietly. Others still believed her story that I'd stolen community land. The rumor mill churned fast. That's the thing about neighborhoods like ours. Gossip is as constant as sprinklers and as lethal as litigation. 2 days later, the HOA filed a notice of intent to challenge with the county, a procedural move meant to stall. My lawyer called it legal theater. Without title or standing, they couldn't stop me. But they could slow me down, force responses, hearings, paper battles. And that's when I realized something. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That weekend, I received a letter on official HOA letterhead, a cease and desist, claiming that the signage posed a safety hazard and disrupted community harmony. I laughed out loud reading that. Community harmony. The same phrase they'd used when banning basketball hoops and front porch flags. They threatened daily fines of $250 per sign, citing unauthorized installation on common visual corridors. You ever see a threat so absurd it becomes poetic? That was it. I drafted my reply that night, concise and formal. The signs are installed on land legally owned by Bluebird Shore Investment Limited, as recorded with the county on blank. Any further attempt to remove, alter, or fine against said signage will be treated as trespass and harassment. It wasn't personal anymore. It was procedural. And procedure, not passion, wins wars like this. The next morning, I found one of the signs leaning crooked, a bolt missing. Maybe kids, maybe Marla. Either way, I reinstalled it, this time with concrete footing and a motion light. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Light exposing darkness, paper beating power. Then came the confrontation I didn't expect. Late Sunday afternoon, I was back at the dock when Marla marched down the path, red-faced, fists balled at her sides. "You've humiliated me," she said, her voice trembling. "You think you can run this place? You'll see what real power looks like." I stared at her. "You've already shown us, Marla, and we didn't like it." For the first time, she didn't respond. She just stood there, breathing heavy, staring at the reflection of that red sign in the water, the word private distorted by ripples. Maybe she realized it wasn't about me anymore. It was about control. That night her porch light stayed off. No patrols, no late-night emails, just silence. Heavy, expectant silence that felt like the calm before a storm. Because if I'd learned anything, it was this. People like Marla don't surrender. They regroup. And as I looked out at the lake, my lake now, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight hadn't even started. What happens when the queen loses her crown but still has an army? We were all about to find out.
"You can't just ban us," she screamed, voice echoing across the community hall, sharp and desperate. I can still see her eyes, wide, frantic, as I slid the trespassing notice across the table. For a split second, the entire room went still. The kind of silence you only hear right before a storm hits. She grabbed the paper with trembling fingers, scanned the first line, and went pale. You could feel the panic ripple through the room. Neighbors shifted in their seats, whispering, phones recording. It was the day the HOA cracked open like cheap plaster, and everyone was there to watch it happen. I didn't want it to come to this, but Marla had forced every hand in the neighborhood. The lake, the signs, the endless fines, she couldn't accept the loss. 3 weeks earlier, I'd received her latest move, a community restoration plan, mailed to every homeowner. In it, she accused me of unlawful privatization, claimed I was undermining the spirit of shared amenities, and even attached an emergency assessment fee of $150 per household to fund legal action. That's right, she billed the entire neighborhood to sue me. The audacity would have been impressive if it weren't so reckless. But here's the thing about HOA law. Procedure is everything. You can't just pass an assessment without majority approval, and you sure as hell can't allocate funds to a case the HOA has no standing in. So I did what any rational man with a pile of receipts and a grudge would do. I called a special meeting, not through her channels, but under Article 5, Section 2 of the bylaws. The homeowner's right to petition for an independent session if 30% of residents sign.
Within 48 hours, I had 67%. That's how we ended up here. The community hall was standing room only. Rows of folding chairs lined the beige carpet, ceiling fans turning lazily overhead. The air smelled of coffee, copier ink, and tension. Marla stood behind the podium like a politician at a scandal press conference, flanked by her remaining loyalists, the same ones who used to nod on cue at her every motion. But this time, they looked nervous. Their queen was cornered, and everyone knew it. "This meeting," she began, voice trembling with forced authority, "is unauthorized. The HOA board does not recognize its legitimacy." "Actually," I interrupted, holding up a printed copy of the bylaws, "it's entirely legitimate under homeowner petition, Section 5, subsection 2. You approved it yourself when you revised these in 2019. The audience erupted in murmurs. Someone clapped. Another shouted, "Read the rules, Marla." She glared at me, jaw tight, a single bead of sweat glinting under the fluorescent light. "You think you can run this neighborhood? You're a troublemaker, a disruptor." "I'm a homeowner," I said evenly, "and you work for us." That line landed like a gavel strike. It wasn't just a retort, it was the truth she'd spent years avoiding. HOAs aren't governments, they're corporations. The board serves the members, not the other way around. But Marla had spent so long playing queen, she'd forgotten she was just an elected volunteer with a clipboard. She tried to regain control. "The board has voted to pursue litigation regarding the unlawful restriction of lake access." "No, we haven't," said Ted, her treasurer, cutting her off. His voice was quiet but steady. "You held that vote without a quorum. You told us you'd handle the paperwork. You lied, Marla." The crowd shifted again, this time in disbelief. Ted had been one of her most loyal allies, the kind of guy who once fined a homeowner for leaving a recycling bin visible after pickup day. And now he was defecting. Marla froze. "Tad, don't—" But it was too late. "I checked with the county clerk," he said, raising a folder. "She owns the lake. The HOA never did. You've been using association funds illegally." That was the crack in the dam. People started shouting. Questions, accusations, curses. Phones went up again, flashes blinking. Marla's composure shattered. She slammed the podium so hard the microphone screeched. "This is harassment. You're all ungrateful." I leaned forward. "Marla, consider this notice your official restriction of access to private property. The lake, dock, and all adjacent paths are off-limits to HOA personnel effective immediately." I slid the document across the table. A formal trespassing notice printed on legal letterhead, notarized and sealed. It wasn't bluster. It was law. She grabbed the paper, crumpled it, and threw it to the floor. "You can't just ban us!" she screamed. "Actually," I said quietly, "I can." For a moment, she just stood there, chest heaving, eyes darting between her board and the crowd that once worshipped her. Nobody moved to defend her. Nobody spoke up. Even her vice president avoided eye contact. That's when the meltdown began. She started pacing, muttering about conspiracies, accusing me of bribery, of manipulating the board, of colluding with external entities. Her words tumbled out faster than logic could catch them. "You'll regret this," she hissed, jabbing a finger at me. "You all will." The HOA lawyer, a gray-haired man who'd been sitting quietly in the corner, finally stood up. "Mrs. Clarkson, I advise you to stop speaking." But she didn't. She couldn't. That's when security, yes, actual county officers, called preemptively for crowd control, stepped forward. The crowd gasped as they approached, hands resting casually near their belts. Nobody was arrested, but the message was clear. The HOA's iron grip had officially rusted through. When it was over, the board adjourned in silence. One by one, they filed out, avoiding my gaze. Marla stayed behind, standing alone by the podium. Her voice was low now, broken. "You think you've won?" she said. "You'll see what this place becomes without me." "I already have," I replied. That night, the HOA's Facebook page went dark. Posts vanished, threads deleted, comments disabled. The next morning, Marla's car was gone. Her porch light, the one that had been on every night for 5 years, stayed dark. Word spread fast. She'd resigned, for health reasons, the email said. Nobody believed it. But the aftermath wasn't clean. The HOA filed a last-ditch appeal with the County Property Review Board, claiming historical stewardship over the lake. They lost, decisively. The ruling cited lack of recorded ownership, absence of conveyance, and improper fund allocation. The language was dry, but the meaning was delicious. Still, victory felt uneasy. I remember walking down to the water the following weekend, the air heavy and quiet. The signs still stood, their red letters bright against the reeds. But something had changed. The neighborhood was different. Quieter, yes, but cautious, like everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop. Because you see, power doesn't disappear. It shifts. And as I stood there, coffee cooling in my hand, I caught sight of something new. A small flyer taped to the community bulletin board. It was unsigned, typed in bold font. New leadership meeting. Let's restore order. I tore it down, but the message lingered. Marla might have melted down, but chaos had just found its next host.
You know what the best part is? I said, standing on my dock months later. The fish are biting again. The sun hit the water like applause. My coffee steamed in the mid-morning chill, and the dock creaked under my boots, exactly like it had the first morning I'd moved in. Only now, the creak felt like a victory lap. People sometimes ask if revenge feels sweet or hollow. I realized it was mostly procedural, tedious, legal, and then quietly satisfying. I didn't gloat. I documented. I filed. I facilitated. Months earlier, after the quiet title judgment and the mediation that left Marla exposed, the neighborhood had to decide whether to nurse old wounds or build new scaffolding for transparency. 3 weeks earlier, I had convened a volunteer committee under Bluebird Shore Investments to draft an access and stewardship plan. We wanted the lake usable, insured, and governed by clear rules, not by whim. We wrote a memorandum of understanding that set hours of access, a modest season pass for maintenance, safety protocols, and an appeal process administered by an independent mediator. We recorded it with the county and offered copies to every homeowner. Transparency was the point, and paper was the weapon. The human aftermath was messy. Marla lashed out, emails accusing me of privatizing a community asset, a recall petition circulated in whispers, and an op-ed in the local paper that tried to frame stewardship as profiteering. She painted the maintenance fund as a cash grab, but facts trumped rhetoric. I published the deed, the recorded memorandum, the independent survey, and the maintenance budget. People read them. The anger cooled. Curiosity replaced instinct. One minor confrontation stands out. A pickup pulled up one morning with 2 men hired by the HOA to erect temporary barricades, waving a county notice that looked official. I walked over, hands empty, and asked to see the paperwork. The packet was a mess. Draft motions, scrawled signatures, and an unsigned check request. Their authority dissolved under scrutiny. One of the men admitted he'd been directed by a board member to act preemptively. That admission turned an escalating stunt into an evidentiary moment. We shifted the scene into the proper frame, recorded statements, a call to the county, and a polite but firm reassertion that any enforcement required documented standing. We focused on making access meaningful rather than performative. The season pass was modest, just enough for lifeguard weekends, erosion control plantings, and solid liability insurance. We installed a labeled canoe rack, a low adaptive dock, and posted a bulletin with bylaws, contract details for vendors, and an explicit complaints procedure so any enforcement had to follow an open, documented path. We insisted on contracts for maintenance vendors rather than vague cleanup fees. Ordinary bureaucracy became our shield and our architecture.
The change was quieter than I expected. Families returned to evening walks, kids fished openly without furtive glances, neighbors who had shied away from meetings showed up to volunteer and learn how maintenance money was spent. The retirees who had once nodded at Marla's pronunciations now planted native grasses with us, deciding who would steward which stretches of shoreline. Small reconciliations happened at the gazebo, others kept their distance. Community is messy and slow to mend. Still, it wasn't idyllic. Marla mounted appeals and a campaign to discredit the effort. Anonymous posts, a few late-night texts, and one act of vandalism where a volunteer's truck had 3 tires slashed. We involved law enforcement, the investigation moved slowly, and tensions simmered. An independent audit of prior HOA expenditures revealed sloppy bookkeeping, unclear cleanup fees, missing invoices, and ad hoc expenditures. The audit didn't deliver poetic justice so much as a manual, clearer contracts, transparent approvals, and mandatory reporting. We proposed bylaw amendments requiring enforcement logs, a published complaints register, and a binding rule that any legal expenditure required member approval. Then, I organized a community lake day. No fees, just rules and volunteers. We announced lifeguards, free bait for kids, and a potluck by the gazebo. The turnout stunned us. Grandparents and toddlers, teenagers on bikes, neighbors I'd only ever waved to. At noon, while the guitar strummed and kids cast lines, I unveiled a small wooden plaque by the canoe rack, held in trust for residents, stewards, not sovereigns. It was a tiny, earnest emblem of intent. Marla didn't vanish quietly. She filed a last appeal, seeking an injunction, and circulated a final recall petition. The court denied the emergency motion for lack of standing. Most neighbors refused to sign anything that felt vindictive. Her threats dwindled into bitterness, late-night forum posts, and muttered accusations at block parties. When people asked me if I felt triumphant, I said not exactly. I felt relieved and exhausted in equal measure. What surprised me most were the confessions from some of her former allies. Private apologies about going along with intimidation because opposition felt costly socially. Rebuilding trust required restitution, a modest fund to refund improperly levied fines where records proved arbitrary enforcement, a professional manager for a transition period, and an independent ombudsman to field complaints impartially. It was bureaucratic, sometimes maddening, and wildly unromantic, but it created guardrails to prevent ambiguity from becoming power. I also learned to appreciate ordinary civic rituals, certified mail receipts stacked like a ledger of accountability, calls with the county clerk whose voice was bored but decisive, and neighborly meetings that traded gossip for minutes and signatures. There was small human goodness, too. The volunteer who baked lemon bars and left them in a tin at the gazebo, the retired teacher who offered to lead kid-friendly fishing lessons, and the couple who refurbished an old rowboat and donated it for supervised use. Those ordinary moments mattered. Months later, standing on the dock with the fish biting again, I watched Marla walk to the shoreline. She paused, hands folded, staring at the new canoe rack and the wooden plaque. She didn't approach. After 20 minutes, she left. A neighbor later told me she'd whispered, "They made it nice." Whether that was praise, resignation, or a private concession, I couldn't say, and it didn't matter. Legally, we'd won the shore and forced transparency into the HOA's arteries. But practically, we'd reclaimed evening rhythms, weekend potlucks, and safe access for families. But power leaves traces, fractured friendships, a budget gap to fill, and a lingering wariness at some block parties. What felt like revenge was actually restoration, cold, bureaucratic, and thorough. I rewired authority toward predictable process, audits, and published records so the next person couldn't weaponize ambiguity the way Marla had. The fish were biting, yes, but the real triumph was small. Rules that made it harder for any one person to turn a community amenity into a throne. I kept thinking about paperwork in the months that followed. certified mail receipts stacked like legal confessionals, late emails to neighbors explaining why a recorded deed changes a conversation more than a shoreline, and the way a surveyor's orange flags could make months of rumor look fragile. There were volunteer rosters and small committees that met under sun hammocks, and the odd human detail, lemon bars, a donated tackle box, and a teacher's patient lesson on knot tying that stitched the place back together. The lake belonged to the people now, in a practical sense, managed, insured, and governed under clear rules. But property fixes the legal problem, not the human one. Systems are easier to guard than feelings, and so we guarded both. So tell me, if you could redesign a small community from scratch, would you build it around a clipboard and theater, or around dull, boring processes that are fair? Which seems easier to defend when someone wants to be a queen?